Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's called the Energy and Resources Group, right? Yeah, Energy and Resources. We're looking at issues of development overall, and she's specifically looking at a particular kind of application of computing for development, which are called these rural kiosks. She was in I'm from the Microsoft Research India lab in Bangalore. She was in our lab for last summer as an intern, and then almost the entire year this year. And you wouldn't know from looking at her now, but she's quite willing to get into some very remote rural areas in the field. She spent a lot of time there. She spent time in Kerala as well as Andhra Pradesh, and in Andhra Pradesh she came back at one point with chikungunya, which is this kind of really bad flu with a twist that is going around in India. But she's recovered from that, and I guess she talks about something she's found with rural kiosks.
Okay, thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about my PhD research and focusing on rural computers and rural development in India. And I've spent the last 2.5 to 3 years off and on in India conducting this research. I'll start with giving you a little bit of background about myself and the project in general. Talk to you about my methods, the locations where I conducted the research, and then I'll talk to you about our argument. I worked with Kentaro on this research, and we came up with a paper that looks at the fact that many of these projects are based on two goals of development and economic development, as well as entrepreneurship and financial sustainability. And so I'm going to talk to you about the tension that we find between these goals in many of these projects at a state level with entrepreneurs as well as with the households that I talk to. And then I'll conclude a little bit and give you some of my personal insights into kiosk viability in India. So basically, as Kentaro mentioned, I've been doing research with MSR in India in the Technology for Emerging Markets group, conducting ethnographic research of kiosks. And I specifically focused in two areas of India, the southwest state of Kerala and in Andhra on the east coast. Today I will be focused more on my work and research in Kerala. Now, the field in which this research takes place, and I just wanted to set a context, is a field called ICT for D, Information and Communication Technologies for Development. There's an interesting convergence of actors from a variety of groups, including the UN, the World Bank, private companies, as well as local grassroots organizations, who find that ICTs can be used as a tool for economic development. And these projects are intimately linked and tied to images of helping poor women and men in rural areas. And the idea is that computing technologies can be used to help leapfrog traditional development problems like poverty and health and illiteracy issues in India. And the interesting thing is that many of these projects are based on a model of development through a process of entrepreneurship. And so it's the idea that private actors, individuals, entrepreneurs, and companies can provide low-cost but high-quality services to the poor who are willing to pay for that. And so that's the premise of these projects. The World Bank funds projects in more than 80 countries in the world. So just giving you a larger international context, this holds quite a bit of importance in funding allocation for development. And then last year, 174 countries signed an agreement to promote ICTs for the purposes of economic development at the UN World Summit on Information Society. So the most flashy and high-profile and often touted project in ICT for D is a kiosk, or also called a telecenter. And these are basically centers in rural areas or remote areas that are kind of like cyberspace cafes. So they have 1 to 5 PCs, and they provide a number of services, including, education, government services, and things like that. And you can see here that they actually vary quite a bit. This is one kiosk which is supposedly functional, and I showed that picture to my friend, and she was like, "This is functional?" This is a very good one. And then this is another one that's just set up in a corner of someone's house, and the electricity bills that they collect are thrown under this chair. So there's quite a bit of variation in kiosks, and they have different goals. One is entrepreneurship. These individual entrepreneurs generally own kiosks based on a franchisee model. And then they also have development goals of promoting literacy and health and poverty alleviation. And sometimes they have a combination of both. Some types of services that kiosks provide are education, so basic courses in MS Word, or even more advanced classes for these rural communities, as well as telemedicine, which is based on the idea that when you have a lack of health care in rural areas, you can have a video conference with a doctor in an urban center. E-governance, which the government can actually deliver their services in rural areas. So an individual farmer or rural person doesn't have to get on a bus, spend 5 hours standing in a line in an urban center. Instead, they can go to their village and pay for the service. And there's a number of things that are highly touted as, great way to promote development, such as providing price information to farmers so that they have more information, they can negotiate with middlemen. And here's an example, this picture, that shows that many of these projects are based on partnerships. And that can include a number of partners. So somebody might walk to a center and see that there are, over 10 partnerships, and that can be confusing to the consumer and the household as well.
When you say that there were lots of different goals, like from entrepreneurship to health, whose goals?
So the projects are implemented by various bodies. So one could be the government, one could be a company, one can be a grassroots NGO organization. And so it's the goals of that institution that's generally focusing what the overall goals of the project should be. Whether those goals are actually met is a different story, because the individual entrepreneur holds a lot of agency to decide what goal they want to do. And actually, I'll talk about that a little more. The interesting thing about India is that there's a great deal of optimism in the country among government workers and NGOs and companies about the potential for kiosks. So there's over 150 projects in India now with more than 10,000 kiosks. The government is also in the process of rolling out 100,000 kiosks throughout the country, and that's been approved. And then you have NGOs as well as companies like Microsoft that see this as a viable way to enter an emerging market, or as a way to deliver, as the government case, to deliver government services to remote communities. So because many projects are based on having both goals of social development and financial sustainability, my motivating question was to understand some of the challenges involved in the simultaneous pursuit of those two goals in kiosks. And so I conducted, for my methods, I used open-ended interviews, which varied from about 40 minutes to an hour and a half. I used participant observation methods, meaning that I actually, in some cases, lived with an entrepreneur or spent time in their kiosks, saw not only what they do during the day, but how they live and how their daily life is connected to their business. And I transcribed and I coded all of my interviews. Additionally, I conducted a small-scale survey just to gather some type of quantitative information about entrepreneurs and households as well. So in terms of open-ended interviews, I conducted over 200 interviews with a variety of actors in different arenas. So that included people from the government at a national level as well as individual state levels, non-governmental actors, industry actors. I talked to and interviewed CEOs of companies and famous people in the IT industry in India, and as well as entrepreneurs and households. So I'm going to, for today's talk, focus on one specific project that I studied in Kerala. So Kerala is well known among people interested in development and in India in general as being a model of development. It has very high levels of social indicators. So there's high levels of literacy, high levels of female literacy, low levels of infant mortality, indicators that are at the top of the charts in India for other states. However, at the same time, they face various economic sustainability issues, meaning that over the last several years, last several decades, they have not been growing and produced as much economic growth compared to other states in India, which have met much lower social indicators. And so it's often seen as this contradiction because of the well-being versus economic growth. It's also well known for having a strong Communist Party presence. It's one of two states in India that the Communist Party holds a strong presence. And as a result, the civil society is very active. There's a lot of activism. And the government is very accountable to them. And so there's a very strong relationship between the government and society. The project that I looked at is called the Akshaya Project. And it is a franchise of computer service kiosks that work as a public-private partnership. And so meaning that the government, it's a government-known project throughout the state of Kerala, but they partner with private entrepreneurs who own and operate the kiosks throughout the state. And I studied this project in the first district in which it was implemented, the pilot project, and now it has been rolled out across the state through 7 other districts, and now they're actually going statewide. So in the district that I looked at, they implemented 630 centers to serve 1,000 households each. And since that project started, now about 200 kiosks have actually shut down. And there's around 430 that work right now. And so the goals of Akshaya is, one, are social goals. The government really wanted to target the quote-unquote masses and bring IT and awareness to the households in the state. They wanted, as well, they're known as a state of having 99% literacy. And government actors talked to me and said, we want to have 99% e-literacy as well. We want each household to really know what computers are and be able to have some basic knowledge of how to operate them. And so the government basically subsidized a process of e-literacy training. So one member from every household in this district that I studied was able to participate in a basic training in computers, which basically meant learning to turn a computer on, use a mouse, see what it is, and get over. The general idea was to overcome your fear of computers. And that was a subsidized process, and with the option that you could come back and pay for another course. The government also thought of this project as an employment scheme. The entrepreneurs that these projects partner with aren't necessarily, I think when people talk about a public-private partnership, you often think of a large company partnering with the government. And in this case, the entrepreneurs are local, they're from these areas, and they are by no means powerful in their voice. And so I think that's a really important thing to note generally. So the government thought this project was also a social development project because they were creating employment for some of these people. And then the other side, you have the other goal is these kiosks must be financially sustainable and run by entrepreneurs. And we don't want to have to subsidize them on a long term, was the government's thinking. And so you have these two roles. The government basically did a lot. Compared to other projects in India, the government did much more investment into these kiosks. They subsidized this training for households. They also provided a lot of training and ongoing support to entrepreneurs. And they provided loans, actually facilitated them through banks, and also established the infrastructure and connectivity. So the entrepreneur, on the other hand, their job is create a business and make it work. And so in understanding, for my research, I wanted to understand, what are some of the challenges that result in pursuing two goals like this. And so some of the outcomes of the project, some of the benefits is that there was a process of e-literacy for the masses. And after interviewing so many households in these areas, people actually felt that they learned something about computers. There was somewhat of a symbolic value of computers that you find that people think that computers are great. And if you probe a little deeper, they don't really know why, but they do think it's great. So there's also things like cost savings and time savings that result because now people can access government services from kiosks. And in some sense of respect. Respect for two things. One is for the household. A woman like this woman, I always change the names of the people that I interview, but this woman, let's say her name is Aishwarya, and she makes $1 a day by selling these beedies or cigarettes. She went to the Akshaya Project training course, and she was able to convince her husband to let her go because other women in her village were also going. And she said, one of her quotes in her own words, which I wanted to get a knowledge of computers. I think it will be useful in my life. I benefited from the course, but there's no way I will go back to that center. I just don't have time or money to go back there. And so the course was a one-time great thing for her because it brought her some type of respect in the community. She felt like she got some knowledge. However, in terms of relevance or money and going back, many household members didn't see a way to invest again to go back. The negative things is it's a one-time benefit, and that's debatable, and something that I'm exploring now is how much does a one-time course actually affect someone's life, and that there's no relevant applications, and also the fact that 200 entrepreneurs shut down their kiosks is no small thing. People's livelihoods are dependent on these kiosks. Entrepreneurs make a huge investment of their money and take out loans, and after a kiosk is not financially sustainable, they have to shut down and kind of look for an alternative while they're in debt. So
what percentage of the total is 200?
It was like 1/3 of the.
A third, wow.
Yeah.
So, sorry, was it always financial, the reasons for closing? Was that
That was probably the largest reason, was that they couldn't get enough customers and they just couldn't pay their debt on the investment that they made to buy the PCs and pay the rent and those types of things. And people, I think that one of the issues is that there's a lot of hype around these projects and a lot that is promised to entrepreneurs who aren't necessarily, have a high education. So they're looking for some type of opportunity in their community. And then when that is not happening fairly quickly, like within 1 year, that they're not making any profit, they end up shutting down.
Is this experiment in a city or a village, and these places which are shutting down, are they farther from the city? Is it representative of the local population around that area?
So many of the projects are implemented in the name of rural development. And what I found is that the kiosks that are the most viable are not in the most rural areas, which is like a population of less than 5,000 people. Those are the kiosks that would shut down, most likely shut down, because they just simply didn't have the population to come in and the demand for services. And so in this area, Kerala is different than I think in other states in India because it's mostly peri-urban. So there's few areas that are totally remote from some type of urban center. But this area that I was in is representative of the state generally, except the one difference in this area is that there's a very high population of people who work abroad and live in the Gulf. And so there's a lot of remittance money that comes into the area that supports the local economy.
So when they shut down, do they shut down for good or?
Yeah.
And what do they do with the hardware? They sell it?
Some try to sell it. Sometimes entrepreneurs are lucky and they can convince somebody else to take over their business. But most of the kiosks that shut down, the entrepreneur either just stores the hardware and then looks for another opportunity.
What are the fixed and recurring costs of a kiosk?
So the fixed cost is the initial investment is in a PC, at least one, and in this project, generally 3 to 4. And then it depends. If the project is owned or run by a private company, then you have to also give some investment to the company for even having that tie and alliance with them. In terms of recurring costs, it's monthly rent, electricity bills, things like that. And initially, as well, you have to invest in your infrastructure of your center. So buying all of these small things that don't seem to be that expensive are a huge burden and cost for these entrepreneurs.
Are those often financed? CICI and one of the labels there.
Yeah, not in this project.
They have to raise the money up front.
They do, and in some situations, the entrepreneurs were able to get some loans from local banks because of the government ties. But I think in general, they often have to give, the upfront cost is very high, so that makes it difficult.
To what extent is their income seasonal or variable over the course of the year?
Yeah, so there's certain times of year where they do get a guaranteed income, and one is when the school results come out for students. And so the government here has made it kind of channeled in customers because of they tried to help these businesses. That's the one place you can access your results is online. So many people come to the kiosks at that time.
Since most of the money is coming through remittances in Kerala, did you observe whether email was being introduced in this first session? Because that should be an enormous motivator.
Right, and so when the project was implemented in this area, it was actually envisioned that communications would be the biggest application. And that is one of the main applications in the centers, is some type of communication and chatting online. And they wanted to do, they envisioned voice over IP as also a big thing. But because of regulatory policies in Kerala, that didn't work out. And also in the initial phases, they had some types of connectivity problems. So the bandwidth wasn't.
I think simple email would be, I don't even use voice over IP to India.
But the thing is that these populations aren't that literate. So their communications, they want to, in the words of, some of these women that I would talk to, they wanted to see their husbands and chat with them. So they either want to talk on the phone or hear their voice in the center. So that was the main thing. Email wasn't as popular, I would guess, for a variety of reasons.
Can I throw something in there? So think about households that don't have a phone at home too. So the promise of a phone is a big deal, however you're going to supply it. And email is dependent on having someone that you would email, right? And so if these are people using a computer for the first time, you don't have a populated list of people in the world that have an email address. So it's a non-thing that exists, whereas talking to someone they know about phones, that's exciting.
It's just that I think voice over IP is unrealistic still.
Perhaps.
And the other thing is that I've seen successful kiosk behavior where there is someone who's illiterate, but it's the kiosk owner who types in and reads. So the kiosk owner is the mediator there. And I think that's a very powerful thing where someone walks by and says, write a note to my daughter. And then, kiosk owner writes this up. And in the evening walk, they come by and they get told the news because meanwhile the time differences have been bridged. And so I think that's a very interesting.
So that's interesting that you say that, because in this population, I'm not sure if this is a major factor, but it's definitely a factor, is that it's a 60% Muslim population. And so there were a lot of factors about husbands not wanting their wives to communicate in front of the entrepreneur, because many of the entrepreneurs are men. And actually, when I lived with that one woman entrepreneur for 10 days, she said some of her most constant customers are women who will travel, even though they have a center nearby, they will actually travel to her center to talk to their husbands or communicate with their husbands there, because of privacy is a big issue.
If I can just speculate on that, it could be a cultural issue also. Even my father, who has a PC at home, he emails everybody else, but he always wants to talk to me. And it's not just me, all my friends over here. Parents just want to talk. It's like email goes out and it's lost. I don't know.
So, did any of these kiosks also operated as telecenters or just provided only computers?
Sorry?
Like, did any of these kiosks also provide like telephone services? Or?
Not in this particular project, but in a project I looked at in Andhra, the government actually had these old STD, ISD booths, telephone booths. That's how they picked their entrepreneurs, because those booths were going out of business because everyone has mobile phones. And they were having less and less demand for that service. So the government, as a gesture and kind of a subsidy, gave them a first shot at becoming entrepreneurs and subsidized the process.
For Kerala, what is the infrastructure sort of like? Like, is it good? Do they have these phone connections mainly in the households, or do most of the people have mobile phones? Do they have good electricity and connectivity? Or?
Yeah, they actually, in terms of the telephone lines, it's very good. Most households have telephones, except definitely in terms of levels of income. But in terms of accessibility to telephone lines, that's there. Mobile phones is increasingly the way people are, especially people who do not have a landline in their home, using mobiles. And then connectivity was a major issue in the beginning of this project, because for a variety of reasons, but in terms of physical geography of the area, it was difficult. And it ends up that, when connectivity is a big issue in the beginning, when the project's being rolled out, it's actually very critical because some of the services don't work. The e-governance services, like the idea of voice over IP wouldn't work there at that time. Now no one will go there for that because it just didn't work in the beginning when the awareness was going on. And so it's like the timing of the project with the infrastructure issues is actually quite critical. So we saw, back to this idea that there's these two goals in the projects. We saw that at the state level, the entrepreneur level, and the consumer level, there was a tension between these goals. And one is that the idea at a state level, I'm talking about the local government in this district. And because Kerala has this communist history and a very state-led development history, if people were pushing the financial sustainability goals, there was a potential risk that you would be criticized for subsidizing the interests of the private sector. And that came out in my interviews with local government actors. And one actor who is very in support of promoting the social aspects of this project and helping the masses, he said, I support the project, but I oppose the type of implementation and style. I mean that financial benefits go to a few, particularly entrepreneurs. I suggest that the entrepreneur selection and all the centers should be owned by the local government, and they should be more supportive of the people or the masses. And so on one side, you have people within the government, pushing for helping the masses, getting IT dissemination and these social goals. On the other side, you have government actors who face a history of criticism because Kerala has always had financial sustainability problems, that they've always been criticized for not pushing their economic growth, and some say it's been at the cost. Pushing social goals has come at the expense of these economic goals. And so you have on the other side, these guys who say, I think that the project should be fully market-driven, and we cannot incur the cost that it would take if we were subsidizing this process on an ongoing basis, or if the government actually owned the project. And so it becomes difficult to actually implement a development project as well as recruit private sector actors to do that. And you have a risk of political criticism, and then you have pressures from this history in Kerala of financial sustainability problems.
How broadly do these same problems apply to other states? Because as you noted, Kerala is unique in some ways.
So in terms of the government, I think in general, the Indian state is, at a macro level, faces these same goals, tension between these goals since independence. And so there's always been a push for redistributive policies as well as, rapid industrialization. And so it's always like, how do you balance that process? And that's often part of the, political process of who gets voted in and who gets voted out. Somebody might, sometime in the former chief minister in Andhra was criticized because he was very pro-IT industry, and the IT industry really, supported him. But he was also criticized because he did not help the rural population. And that's very debatable, but that was the kind of discourse that was out there. And then we saw this tension with entrepreneurs as well. And with my interviews in Kerala, I conducted 14 interviews with entrepreneurs on, often on several occasions with these same individuals. And it seemed that these entrepreneurs could be divided into three types of entrepreneurs. The ones that were very socially driven, pushing for these social development goals, and then on the other extreme, the ones that are purely focused on business. And then we found the rarity in the middle of a few entrepreneurs who wanted to try to balance these goals. So I want to tell you the story of 3 different entrepreneurs who I think represent some of these types. One is Musa. Musa is an entrepreneur who is very socially driven. And he joined the Akshaya Project because he felt that it was his duty to try and help the population, and particularly the marginalized groups in his district. He also, he wanted to he wanted to join the project as well. He had an existing computer center that he had been working at for about 6 years. And after talking to him, it became clear that he had a very fluctuating income. Sometimes he had a great loss, and sometimes he kind of got around $57 a month in profit. His main services were, one was the e-literacy training. He got subsidized by the government to do that, so he felt like he, really made some money and met all of his social goals. And then he did some education services. But in his perspective, he thinks his business is doing very badly. And actually, subsequently to interviewing him, he has closed down his business and has moved to the Gulf to look for a better job and a better life. But Musa, one quote by Musa is that, "Even though my center closed down, I was successful because many rural people got an awareness of computers, and that is good enough. Next time, the project should be planned so that the government pays for the initial equipment, and then afterwards, the entrepreneur can run the center." And so, again, with this type of entrepreneurs, there was a large sentiment of government subsidy, and that's how they could eventually be successful, but that they would be meeting their social goals. And then you have someone like Ram, and he is very business-driven. He has a bachelor's degree and also some background in computer training. And he actually earns quite a good wage for that area. And he started his center in 1998, and then he joined the Akshaya Project in 2001. And he thought that the e-literacy training process was fine. He was able to leverage that to get more customers, and he did. But he said that generally he doesn't cater to the population of people who comes to do that e-literacy training, because they tend to be poor or housewives or people that won't necessarily come back to help him run his business. So basically, he talks about the fact that, what does it mean that I'm running an Akshaya center? It just means I offer one Akshaya course since the e-literacy period is over. Most of the students come for my private courses, not the Akshaya courses. The aged and the other people just take e-literacy courses once, and they say they will never use computers again. Most don't. And so he felt that, he needed to cater to the middle class and those people who would actually come back and take his higher level computer classes. And then you have Henna, she's one entrepreneur who tries to balance the goals of social development and financial sustainability. And she's actually the entrepreneur that I lived with. And her services are education, and she tries to cater to the middle class to come and do those services. But she also feels that, this is a development project. So she tries to cater to low-income groups. And she says that the secret of her success is that she can actually act as a government mediator. So the reason why low-income groups will come and will come again and pay for her services is because people, she would talk about the fact that people just don't know how to deal with the government. And they would come to her center, ask her some type of obscure question, and she would make it her duty to find out, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on the phone, whatever, she would figure out how to get them to come back, because she would provide them with the information. And then that would be one way to just initially get them. Then she would help them with, additional services that are not necessarily online services, like photocopying or, printing out forms, things like that. And she also sees that her business is, as a public-private partnership, it's not that the government should be subsidizing her. She feels that she needs to be a real businessman, and that she can do that with the name of the government, but not directly associated with it.
Do they have employees, or they just do it on their own? Just one individual?
What's that?
Do they have employees? Or they
Yes, she has 3 employees. So she has people who teach computer classes for her, and who basically operate the center on a daily basis. And she herself actually goes there every day, though some entrepreneurs do not.
Roughly what percentage of entrepreneurs fall into each one of these 3 profiles?
Of the ones that I talked to?
Yeah, what's your sense of that?
I would say that these profiles are changing as the government is learning more and more. So I think in the initial phase, that probably, 30% of the people were the the very business-oriented ones, and probably another, I don't know, maybe 50% were trying to be business-oriented, not necessarily being successful at it, but trying. And I think that there were so many socially oriented ones, not necessarily that they were actually socially oriented, but that they were getting a big subsidy to be socially oriented. So they, it's a lot of that. And then I think the henna type of people is just a minority. So. And so the main challenge that we find is that there are really 2 types of populations that need to be targeted to meet both of these goals. It's a population who are actually in need of these development services, and then the population that can actually make a kiosk profitable. And those tend not to be the initial picture I showed you of the poor women, but that's, and end up being the middle class, the more elite, the educated, and they're willing to pay for education courses. And so the challenge for entrepreneurs becomes how to attract both segments of this market. The other thing is branding becomes an issue, because with the association that, Akshaya is a development project and that is linked to your business, people like Ram didn't want that association, because historically in Kerala particularly, there's a lot of perceptions associated with development projects. One, that they're targeting the poor. They're probably targeting rural populations. And most likely they're less quality services than what you would get if you were in a private computer course. So he has Akshaya just as one part of these other signs of his. And so but then you have Musa, who only branded as Akshaya, and because that's who he was trying to attract. So it becomes a balance of how do you try to brand this? Do you brand it as a development project or as a business? And then the same tension occurs with the consumers. And, many consumers, on a positive note, see this as a development project and see that, yes, a lot of low-income households who've never seen a computer had the opportunity to do that and overcame their fear of technology. But then you have some of the middle-class consumers who would say, if I have the option, I will not go to an Akshaya center, because most likely it has lower quality education services than if I go to a private place. And actually the person who told me that was was a student in Ram's center. So she didn't know that that was actually an Akshaya center, because he doesn't sell his business as Akshaya. So there's several perceptions that drive the possibilities in this project. And one is a skepticism of the quality of state services. As I said, that they could be free or serve the poor, and they're used in rural areas. And these ultimately affect the way that these entrepreneurs brand their kiosks. But at the same time, if a project is promoting government services, so Akshaya is, their main goal is to promote education services, and government services is one aspect of it. But in some other projects, government services is the main push. You can pay your electricity bills. You can pay for birth certificates, death certificates, those types of things. And in that case, there is a legitimacy in associating with the government because people don't trust a private individual that they can actually get the services done for them. And so the government is in a process of kind of renegotiating its own image in India. And this is the traditional image of a government electricity bill payment place. You would stand in the sun for hours, you would have a long line, and there's nowhere to sit. And then this is kind of the new way that the government is trying to portray itself, that it's much more efficient, it's friendly, and you can even get a glass of water when you're waiting for your service. So, in conclusion, we see that these tensions make it very difficult to meet the twin goals of commercial profitability and social development. If the state overemphasizes financial sustainability, there's some political criticism risk. And if they're promoting social development and overemphasizing that, then there could be, and there are, the issues that the state has to provide ongoing support. And the entrepreneurs buy into that as well. So I just wanted to, at the end, to talk a little bit about some of the insights that I've gathered from looking at so many kiosk projects basically on the viability of these kiosks. And one is the types of services that actually are able to help entrepreneurs generate revenue. And that one is computer education. It's not necessarily that you're going to target the poorest people, but education generally in India is highly valued, and people are willing to pay for that service. And so in the kiosks that I saw that were most financially viable, they were offering some type of education services, or they were also offering government-to-citizen services in situations where the government would actually shut down all other options of payment. So there you had a great deal of political will by the government that they were helping to drive customers to these kiosks, and they would actually only allow that as your outlet to pay your bills. And those entrepreneurs, that was actually one project in Andhra which was the most successful project that I saw. And most entrepreneurs were making a good profit. Geography and size, that's also kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of rural.
So the government was pushing that service, so people were going and paying though. So the consumers were paying to use the government service. They weren't subsidized in that.
No, the government, so generally a consumer goes to a government office and just pays their bill.
Yeah.
And now they just go to this entrepreneur's office and pay their bill. And the government pays the entrepreneur some commission for doing that on each transaction. Yeah.
Customer. Got it.
And actually, that leads me to the per transaction costs. That's actually an interesting thing, because in that Andhra case where the government's doing that and the cost is hidden, people have, they're willing to do that. It's much more convenient and efficient. But in Kerala, e-governance services has not taken off at all. And the transaction cost, the consumer has to pay 2 rupees to the government, which is nothing, it's a few cents to pay for this government service. But they won't do it. They would rather take the bus and go stand in the line than do that. And so there's a perception of how you kind of, bundle your costs or make them upfront or hidden is actually quite critical too.
So when somebody is done taking one of these computer education courses, where do they exercise that education?
So that's a good question, because there's a big hype about you should take computer education courses, and that's kind of your way to get a job. many of the households may find some, value in doing that, but I think that the amount of members who actually get jobs that they're using computers to do is minimal. And I think there's a big, obviously rural-urban migration, but again, it's difficult to actually, there's a lot of graduates from these types of courses in India, but from a kind of IT company perspective, the quality of those graduates is so low that they're not willing to hire those types of people.
Do you see the potential for, say, very basic BPO activities?
There's some efforts of doing that now, and it's all kind of experimental, but it's very, very basic. And I think that the people who actually end up getting those jobs are probably, the most qualified and highly educated people in that area. So it wouldn't be that I just took a course at the Akshaya Center and now I can work in a BPO.
Do you see that as a potential source of income generation, though, for a kiosk? If there's, there will always be more and more basic services that can be pushed out to BPO.
And the government's actually outsourcing some of its own, data entry and things like that to these kiosks in Kerala for birth certificates and death certificates. So at that level, the actual entrepreneur is doing the work, but yeah, that's definitely happening, and it's kind of an emerging area
where you have the government subsidize the use, for the government service. Did you see any additional use of the services that were, and use of pay services that were also offered to kiosks?
Yeah. So that was kind of the reason why that project was so successful, was that they were getting regular customers on a bi-monthly basis, and then they would also be providing basic services like photocopying and things like that, and digital photography, which those were all, just additional. Those weren't their money makers. Their main moneymaker was the fact that they could get these regular stream of customers from the government. And in terms of geography, that was also extremely critical in terms of who was the most profitable kiosks. The ones that were the most profitable were working at the largest, kind of district levels in these areas, because then they can get customers from these 10 villages over here and for this month, and then these 10 for the next month. So they have a constant stream of people. But then you have the village, the projects that are very village-based, and they only rely on their immediate population for all of their income. And those were the kiosks that just weren't viable.
How far then people have to travel to get to their machines?
Maybe like 10 kilometers.
But that's still less than going to the government office.
Yeah, for that area, yeah. And so we talked about branding, and then just partners, creating partnerships in these projects with, the local. If companies are coming in, most oftentimes they're doing it with partners who actually are working on the ground, are a trusted and consistent presence in a village, and that credibility and that legitimacy is extremely important for the implementation as well. And then the two projects that I found most successful in terms of the entrepreneurs both had a champion who was part of the local government who pushed the project through, and at any cost. And they kind of had this huge belief in the potential of IT, and it might have been irrational at times, but it was definitely helpful to this process. And the fact in some of the projects I've looked at where it's a private company that has a franchisee of kiosks that are implementing services or delivering services, those projects that didn't have a champion were much more difficult because the bureaucracy simply of dealing with the government is so difficult and slow. And so when these champions in both projects were members of the local government. And then both of those projects had ongoing training, and they had some form of indirect subsidy, like into training or the e-literacy process, because in that initial phase, those entrepreneurs are very, not on solid ground in terms of their business skills anyway. And so some of the training in those projects were in, not just in, how do you use this online tool, but how do you make a business viable? What are some ways to marketing tools and things like that? And then finally, what I saw in a project where there's a private company working with individual entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneur actually has to pay the company for each transaction that they're doing, it becomes very difficult, particularly in the first year, for an entrepreneur to be financially viable.
Was there any level of national government involvement at all in these projects? Or?
National?
Yeah.
Yes. So the national government now has this project that they're rolling out 100,000 kiosks throughout the country. And what they're going to do is not necessarily put up 100,000 kiosks, but partner with these existing projects. So they will be under the overall umbrella of the national government. And they've been very good at supporting these initiatives as well. There's just so much optimism that this is going to be this great tool, and also income generating tool for the entrepreneurs.
So in case of that kind of partnership, what will that partnership entail?
So that's a controversial issue, because in the Akshaya Project, the state government directly partners with entrepreneurs. But now that the central government's coming in, they have their own setup of how the projects are supposed to run. And in Kerala, they really don't want to change the way that they're doing things. They think it's working. And so now they're at each state level, there's a state level negotiation of how the project will take place. Thank you very much.